Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
For many students, the most challenging part of writing an academic essay is developing a thesis statement. And thesis statements, I think, are difficult because students are not accustomed to thinking about their writing in that way. However, I think we are used to thinking about our speaking in that way. And here's what I mean. A thesis statement is one sentence in any piece of writing that essentially tells us the point. What is the point? What is the essential argument? And when we're talking about an argument, we're talking about something that is different than a fact. A fact is something which any reasonable person would agree with. Okay? Now, you could argue, well, some types of thesis statements essentially are communicating a fact, and that would be true. But that kind of thesis statement is communicating a fact to an audience, to a reader that doesn't know that fact. And so, for example, let's say that you send a letter to a client telling them about some sort of regulatory change in your business. Well, you're just telling them a fact, right? But the only reason you're sending it to them is because they presumably don't know it, or you're not sure whether they know it or not, and you just need to make certain that they do know it. So even then, you have to treat it is not a fact in the sense of everyone already would agree with this. Every reasonable person would agree with this. A thesis is also not an opinion. So what do I mean by an opinion? Well, when we're talking about an opinion, what we're saying is something which you believe to be true and is not a fact, however, that you could not, through evidence, convince another person of. So what do I mean by this? Well, I think that nachos are the best food. Nachos are the best food. The problem with that is, if I were to write an essay about that, is that that is an opinion. It's different than an argument because as an opinion, I could not, if you don't like nachos, I could not persuade you to like nachos. There's no way that I can offer enough evidence to make you start liking nachos. It's just my opinion. And so almost off the bat, any thesis statement that says, such and such is the most important or is the greatest, is the top of the such and such in a kind of evaluative way, almost always those thesis statements are going to not really work as thesis statements because they'll just be opinions, right? So if I tell you that, that carbohydrates are the most important part of a meal, maybe you don't agree with that. Maybe you're trying to build muscle mass, and so you think meat is. Maybe you don't think a meal is all about just delivering the most amount of calories and the least amount of bites, right? Maybe you think vegetables are. So by saying it's the most important part, in that case, then it sounds more like I'm saying something that's not an opinion, but in fact it is, because I couldn't create enough evidence to show you that it is the most important part. So a thesis is the point of your writing, your essay, and that point of it is, in fact, in some way, is not a fact and is not an opinion. It's instead something that the average person either doesn't know or wouldn't necessarily agree with, but you could persuade them with evidence, right? If they already know it, why are you writing it, right? If they could not be persuaded with evidence, why are you presenting evidence, right? And so this is what you want out of a thesis statement. And we all know people who have difficulty in giving the point of a story that they're telling, right? Someone who they begin to tell a story about something that happened in their lives, and by the time you're 5 minutes or 10 minutes into the story, they've forgotten why they started telling the story, and they're just giving a bunch of details that don't get us to a point. Or once they get to the point, you think, well, why did I waste all my time with that? That was not important enough, right? That would be the idea of a weak thesis, right? Something that's not important enough. All right, so let's talk about some thesis killers, some things which will kill a thesis statement immediately. Well, one thing that's a thesis killer is stating a thesis in the negative, right? So, for example, if I said, there is no reason to have no vegetables in a meal. By stating it in the negative, all I've said is what isn't. A good thesis statement will say what is. And so if I wanted to say that, I would say vegetables should be included in every meal. Now, you might say, isn't that an opinion? But I could persuade you of that through evidence. I could argue vegetables should be included in every meal because they contain vitamins and nutrients that are necessary for people to live healthy lives. And you could be persuaded by that. And then the body of the paper is going through all the kinds of nutrients and vitamins that only vegetables provide and are not provided by other foods or not provided enough by other foods, and how and how those help our health. Okay, that would be a paper. So one thing is, don't state things in the negative, state them in the positive. And to be clear, this means the grammatical negative. You can state something that's attitudinally negative. What I mean by that is you can say that the new kinds of cars fail the old safety tests. Failure in that case might seem negative, but in terms of grammar, it's positive. It'd be negative to say, like, they don't pass them. You want to say they fail them. You want to say what the truth is, not what isn't. So that's one of the big thesis killers. Another big thesis killer is to talk about your paper as if you're outside the paper. So, for example, often I'll see students say, I'm going to explain why Shakespeare made Desdemona such an important character. Well, that's not a thesis statement. That's saying that eventually a thesis statement will come. The real thesis statement would be like, why does Desdemona matter? And the answer to that question, why does Desdemona matter? And you would explain why Desdemona matters, right? So almost any thesis statement that says, this paper is about blah, 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 or I will explain blah, blah, blah. Almost always those are bad theses. Now, you might say, well, I've heard that before. Aha! One place that's a good place to use them is in public speaking. Because in public speaking, there's an old cliche that we say, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. Okay. And so when it comes to public speaking, you need to reiterate over and over again. You need to say, I'm going to say this thing, and then you say the thing, and then you come back and you say that you just said it, as I've done many times in this presentation today. However, when you're talking about writing a text, in a written text, your reader can stop, they can slow down, they can go back and reread it. So you don't need to repeat the thing. Don't say, I'm going to explain XYZ. Just explain XYZ. That's the thesis statement. Okay? And I would say probably the biggest problem that students have with their thesis statements is they have a thing which grammatically looks like a thesis statement, but it doesn't answer the question, who cares? So what? Why is this important? A good thesis statement should make clear why the thing that they're telling you is important, why it matters. Now, you usually won't have the phrase, and this is important because, or this matters because. However, in the thesis, it can have it, and in the thesis statement, it will tell you, it will explain to you the importance of the thing that is happening. So, for example, if I'm teaching Othello, one of the things I like, which is a play by Shakespeare, one of the things I like to point out to students in Othello is that the opening of Othello is very confusing. It seems like Shakespeare has written it very poorly. But in fact, Shakespeare is being confusing on purpose, because later on, Shakespeare wants the audience to be able to sympathize with Othello when he becomes confused and believes things which are completely unbelievable. And so I could write a thesis statement that says, although Shakespeare appears to write Othello from the beginning in an amateurish and bad way, in fact, he's writing in a confusing way so that the audience will sympathize with Othello later on when Othello becomes confused. There you go. There's a thesis statement. It's something it's not a fact, because it's something the average person doesn't already know or doesn't already necessarily believe, right? But unlike an opinion, I could persuade you that that's the case. I could show you lines from the text and I could persuade you that's the case. That then would be a thesis statement. And in there's the essential idea of like why it matters. It matters because it explains what appears to be a mistake in Shakespeare. It explains that what appears to be the mistake is not a mistake. The hardest part of any writing is the point. I'll often tell students that they should probably spend, in terms of their preparation, their pre-writing, they should probably spend about 50% of their time just writing that one sentence, that thesis statement. Because if the thesis statement is strong, it will help the rest of your paper be strong. But a weak thesis statement or no thesis statement will leave your reader saying, what was the point and why did I read this?